Welcome to the 1334 podcast. My name is Blake Barlow, and today I'm joined with Darla Harms. If you could, really quick, give us a little introduction to who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Blake. It's good to see you. We go way back, man. What, 9 years, something like that?
Something like that.
Yeah, known you for a minute. So we met through the Grace City Church school ministry, and I taught their leadership course, and I met Blake there, and I'm a leadership and mindset coach, speaker, trainer, and author. I'm in my 12th year of doing that, and so been studying leadership for 25 years, but had my own business for about 12. And I've helped hundreds of people in leadership positions across the United States and in 3 different countries. And so it's been quite an adventure, I'll tell you that, hanging out with all these leaders.
That's cool. And you've been connected to nonprofits, right?
Yes. So I've been an executive director. I've been a chairman of the board. I've attended board meetings. I've served on boards in just more of an advisory capacity. So I do have a little bit of experience with nonprofits.
Awesome. Well, so today I wanted to kind of dive into your leadership knowledge and ask a few questions that I feel like could relate to nonprofits that tune in and listen, and hopefully give them a little bit of easy access to some leadership training.
Sure. Let's go.
So what are some of the most common leadership mistakes that you can see across the board, like not just nonprofits, but just in general?
Yeah, it's a good question, Blake, because I think if you're going to talk about leadership, people have to realize that leadership applies to any situation, not just nonprofits, but for-profits, small businesses, as you know, being an entrepreneur, and anything in between. So these statements are really kind of very basic. They apply to everyone. But one of the most, well, I actually have a list here of common mistakes that people make, and I've made them myself too. So still learning as I go as well. So I think the biggest one is that leaders are either too passive or too aggressive, and that really either extreme on a spectrum they're both very destructive behavior. Another one is not defining people's roles and responsibilities, kind of leaving it up to people to figure out how things are supposed to go, which is never good, because they'll have a different expectation than you will. Another one is letting people cross over into other people's lanes. And so once we establish our organization and we've got our responsibilities set, we want people to stay in their lane. So if people cross over, it can become a very toxic situation if they go into another person's lane with the wrong motives. Another one is not holding people accountable or learning how to have these difficult, crucial kind of conversations that resolve conflict. Another one is lack of emotional intelligence. I see it, I've seen it a lot, that people are very smart. They may have a high IQ, but their EQ is in the tank. And there's a lot behind that. I mean, I don't know if it's common. It's just it's a mistake. I mean, it can really cause problems with any organizational structure. And I don't know that we're educating people enough on EQ and how. I mean, there's tons of studies that show that people with a higher emotional intelligence actually do better than people with a high IQ. So, I mean, you can have average intelligence and a high emotional intelligence and be very, very good at your job, very good at life, reading people. You can have a high IQ and have low EQ, and nobody wants to work with you. So you might be brilliant, but you also may be a jerk, or you may be passive aggressive, or you're difficult to get along with. So EQ doesn't get enough. It's a huge mistake people make by not giving it enough attention. Another one would be not investing in their people. Well, I'm all for personal and professional development, and we need to be responsible ourselves to to enter into that journey, it is also the organization's responsibility to make sure that they're providing that to some degree or another. Here's one of my favorites that I see. Well, I don't know if it's a favorite because it's a huge mistake, but Cy Wakeman, she wrote reality-based leadership. She calls them drive-by BMWs. And a drive-by BMW is a bitching, moaning, and whining. So allowing that to go on, I mean, there's going to be some drama within any organization, but the extent to which you allow that, some organizations absolutely have no cap. They just let it fly. And
Really?
that's a huge mistake. Oh,
Yeah.
sure. Oh, yeah. That's very common, by the way.
You would
To
think that
allow-
would get shut down most places.
Yep.
That's crazy.
It's allowed because it's what people know. I mean, Blake, you've heard this, right? But it's just who people are. You know, there's always going to be gossip and toxicity among people. And that is a true statement.
Yeah.
However, you don't have to allow it as the leader. You can minimize it. Yes, it will happen to an extent. People are people. But the extent to which it's allowed and allowed to permeate the organization, it really will impact your culture. And if you want a positive, uplifting culture, you have to minimize those BMWs.
Yeah.
Right. They might look good as a car, but in a person, it's kind of a, not such a great quality. And we've all done it. It's just the extent. Can we catch ourselves? Can we catch our people? Can we offer a better way to resolve, issues going on in the workplace? And the last one is when organizations allow what's called the third option. So this is another Cy Wakeman kind of teaching, right? So in her philosophy, she's a drama researcher. She works a lot in leadership with healthcare organizations. And I love the statement that she gives, that people need to either stay in joy or leave in peace. And there shouldn't be a third option. And that third option is when people stay with no joy,
Mm-hmm.
and they sabotage their work and they get paid. So often the biggest mistake organizations make is allowing someone who's not happy, toxic, not performing well, to stay and get a check.
Yeah. That actually, I kind of want to jump ahead a little bit because that reminds me a lot of like volunteers. I've got the pleasure to work with a lot of volunteers, and that sounds a lot like working with volunteers because a lot of the time you'll find people are serving out of, they said they will, so they feel like they have to, and so they don't have the joy or that peace. So that's a really cool, a really, really cool take on it. Is there anything you would say regarding, working with volunteers? Do you have any tips or advice? Because I know that's kind of leading in a different way.
Well, I think that's the mistake. People see it differently than they would if it was a business, and I think they should be run the exact same way.
Really?
Absolutely. I think they should have a job description. I think they should have a handbook, code of ethics. I think there should be expectations. Now, it depends on the role of the volunteer, right? If you're just coming in on a Saturday for a couple hours,
Yeah.
that's different than someone who's giving you 5 to 10 hours a month of their time, right? So if they're in a leadership role, or as we define leadership as influence, if they're in an influential role, then they need to be treated just like an employee and held performance reviews, accountability. There needs to be a path for moving them out of the organization if need be. And volunteers are amazing. I mean, you can't have a nonprofit without them. However, it can really sabotage your organization if they're there for the wrong reason. They're using your organization to find their worth. They don't know their worth. So by volunteering and helping, like, I serve a sex trafficking nonprofit. Okay, well, they come and help. So, look, I'm such a good person because I'm helping with sex trafficking nonprofit. Okay, great. We love that. But you can't find your worth in that. You're there to serve and not necessarily be served.
Yeah.
And so while we need to have that mentality about volunteers, they also have the mentality that they're there for something other than themselves and really hold things loosely. Also, you need to make sure your volunteers know exactly what's expected of them because they'll switch lanes.
Yeah.
They need to stay in their lane. And that's how you keep peace
How do
is
you,
when every
so for my nonprofit, like we do video production, graphics, editing. Um, how how do you keep someone in a lane that's not super narrow? Like I know there's a lot of nonprofits that maybe they pack backpacks for people, but there's also another volunteer that's organizing everything. And so the person organizing is going to have a much wider lane that they're going to be doing a lot of different things. How do you how would you go about like organizing each one of those roles?
Well, I would absolutely write everything down and make sure it's really clear before I even assign that person a responsibility. Now, if you're a startup nonprofit, kind of like yours, a little bit, I mean, you've been at it, what, 2 or 3 years now? Is that
Yeah.
right, Blake?
This October will be 3 years.
Yeah, okay. So I knew you're coming three-ish, somewhere in there. So at first, yeah, you're going to have to feel your way through what people do
Yeah.
because you don't know what you don't know. And I think that's the other thing. I'm going to sidetrack for just a moment and come back to your question. When you establish a board, you need to establish what kind of a board, right? You have a governing board or a serving board. And the mistake that I made with the nonprofit that I helped get going is that I only know governing boards. I'd never been taught about a serving board. And we really should have established that nonprofit as a serving board and then moved into a governing board because our executive director needed a lot of volunteers. She needed boots on the ground.
Yeah.
She needed a lot of hands-on help. And the board couldn't give that to her because of other responsibilities that they had. So we should have looked for other board members who could have served more. Okay, so that is really important because if you have board members serving or governing, how you handle your volunteers will be different because you'll need a lot of serving volunteers and more than maybe if you had a serving board who acted on behalf of the volunteer, right? They were the volunteer.
Yeah.
That step is that I'm kind of rambling there.
No, that makes perfect sense.
Okay, good. So yeah, at first it might be a little wonky, right? It's a learning curve to figure out who should be doing what and what their responsibilities are. But that should absolutely be intentional that you're figuring that out. So something that happened on the board that I was chairman of the board is that a lot of that was left up to the volunteer to kind of define for themselves instead of us defining it for them, and it went haywire. It did not go well because they had a very different agenda than what the board or the executive director had. Now, it's the board's fault. It's the executive director's fault because they didn't clearly establish the lane for that volunteer and have a process for accountability and run it like a business to some degree, and that there's a process for moving people in and out of those key volunteer positions. So had to learn that the hard way, fixed it. Things went much better once everyone's role was defined.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, that's brilliant. I didn't realize I needed that. Cool.
Good.
So taking a little positive spin on everything, who is the best leader that you've worked with and what made them so good?
That's a really tough question because I've worked with a lot.
I know you have, and if you can't say their name, that's okay too.
Well, I'm thinking of 3 people. 4, oh man, 5, 6. Okay, I don't know. Here are the qualities that they all had.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, they were kind. I mean, that seems like a really simple word, but there's so much depth to kindness. It cannot be overstated. At the heart of who they were kind. Kind people. I mean, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10, they were the sweetest, nicest people I've ever met. So that resonates with me because you can be brilliant and not be kind, and nobody cares how brilliant you are. So because of their kindness, their brilliance just shined bright. Because at the heart, they were kind people. They valued their employees. So, if you were we influence people in direct proportion to the value that we assign them. So if on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being awesome, the best kind of person you could be, which I believe how God sees us, right? We're all 10s in his eyes. We're all created by him for a purpose and valued, and Christ came for us. But if I only value people at a 3, and let's say I give you high value, right? We've known each other a long time. I have mad respect for you and your wife and your family. I mean, I would put you more on the 10 range. But if I had you and the 3 in the same room, and I treated you differently, you would respond differently to me.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself is wrong. Even though everyone's a 10. And I need to treat them like a 10, whether they've earned it or not, whether they see themselves as a 10 or not. Maybe you, Blake, had more talent and we got along better and we had a better working relationship. And then there was another person, maybe it was a little rough. But if I valued that person like I valued you, I would want to lift them as high as I could, just like I would with you. And that might look different, but that's okay. But I have to treat them the same way I would treat you, someone that I value at a 10. And the greatest leaders I know value people at a 10. They see them all equally as valuable, whether they've earned it or not.
And would you say that? My first thought is that reminds me a lot of the janitor analogy. You treat the janitor the same as you treat the principal, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how you teach your kids, But I was wondering, would you say that's the single most important thing to be a good leader, is treating everyone with, being humble and treating everyone with respect? Or is there something else that creates, I was wondering what the through line is, what's connecting the greatest leaders?
Well, I don't think it's any one thing, because I think some are better at some things than, I don't think you can pin it down to one thing. I think some are going to be better at some things than other people, right? I've worked for extroverted leaders. I've worked for introverted leaders. I've worked with people who were very influential in the organization but didn't have a big title. I've worked with big titles and CEOs, presidents that had very little influence. People didn't respect them. Yeah. And so I would say kindness, valuing people, humility, being teachable, willing to eliminate your ego and not be a right fighter all the time. I mean, there are times when you have to put your foot down and say, no, this is what we're doing. But being able to listen to people and get their feedback is absolutely crucial. So, having a vision, where are you going, your values, your code of ethics, all of those are really, really important. Now, communication and conflict resolution, that all ties in. And again, I see leadership and all the skills of leadership on a spectrum. So from 1 to 10. And you might be a 10 at communication and a 7 at vision, right? I don't know. But somebody else may be a 10 at vision and a 7 at communication. So a great leader, here's one thing that all great leaders do. They surround themselves with people who complement their weaknesses.
That's
And
brilliant.
they're not afraid of that person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing, do you know who John Lovell is?
I know the name. I don't know why. Who
He's
is it?
uh he's the author of Warrior Poet, I believe it's called.
Okay.
But I listened to a podcast he was on. I listened to it today actually, and he was saying that Warrior Poet, like those two together, they're juxtaposed in the right way. He said he sees people, men and fathers in particular, that you need to find the balance in between the two. He said a you have to be a lion and a lamb. You have to find the balance in between the
Mm,
two. And it sounds it sounds like to be a good leader is the same way. Like you need to
abs-
be right in between, and then any of the more detailed areas, like you say, communication. Um, if you're really bad at communicating to a lot of people at once, trying to find a person that can level
Support.
you out.
Yeah. Brilliant. I love the lion and the lamb analogy, right? Because that's what Christ is. And I mean, he's no pushover, but he's the kindest person you'll ever meet,
Yeah,
right? But he's a warrior. I mean, he's going to fight for people, but yet he would sacrifice so much for people.
yeah.
And that it is it's not a problem to solve, it's a tension to manage.
Ooh, say that again. I think I need to write that down.
So it's not a problem to solve, it's a tension to manage.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So it's not either or. It's not this or this. It's both and.
Hmm.
And it's knowing when to apply which situation. So let's just say you were raised. Well, I had a client, let me use this example, who was a rageaholic. And he just, warrior was, I mean, he was on all the time, warrior mode, yelling, screaming, cussing, finger in your face, you lousy, no good SOB, get your SHIT together. I mean, just extreme. Then the business partner, Lamb, quiet, passive, never caused waves. And they're trying to run this company and it's not going well. You got, of course, squeaky wheel gets the grease in this case, right? So the loud one is always the one up front. And then the lamb one, right? The poetic, quiet one is getting the picking up all the pieces
Hmm.
from the other partner. It's just a really toxic, dysfunctional situation. So, absolutely, it's about finding the balance, knowing when to calm down, and knowing when to speak up. And that only comes with practice. That comes with time and learning and talking to people and making mistakes and realizing maybe I need to give my people permission. Like I want to grow as a warrior and a lamb, right? I want to grow in this area as your leader. So telling people, yeah, because okay, so Rachel Monroe is executive director of Heritage of Hope, and so I was her chairman of the board, and she had permission to say, Darla, you need to calm down. Like you're going too much at this point because that's Rachel's quiet and like peaceful, and I would be like, raw, right? Let's move. But together, I could say, Rach, you need to step it up. You need to be a little more forceful. And she'd be like, Darla, you need to calm down. And it really worked well
Yeah.
because I could receive it and so could she without becoming defensive.
And I think that's kind of what that's the humility again, like
Yeah.
understanding and listening and knowing, okay, I'm not right 100% of the time. I need to take the criticism from someone else. That's cool.
Yeah. In both person, because I think everybody thinks the warrior's the one that struggles with humility, right? They're the one that needs to calm down. Well, sometimes the other person who needs to step up needs to hear it too.
Yeah.
Can still be pride. It's just past false humility is still pride.
Mm.
So both need to come down, the other one may need to step up. And so you need to surround yourself with people who can tell you stuff like that and who feel, don't become, don't hold it against them, but receive feedback and be
Yeah,
teachable and learn from them.
absolutely.
Mhm.
So how, if you're an employee or a super, you know, you're heavily involved in an organization, or even you're the officer, you're like the executive officer and you're boots on the ground, how
Mhm.
would you lead the board of um, directors? Would you say governors and servers? Any type of board, how would you lead them from the front? Like boots
Well,
on the
first,
ground.
yeah, I think, like with Heritage of Hope, I helped Rachel pick the board, right? We just kind of put the board together. And I really thought it was important to find people who could stay in their lane, who were going to be good at what they said they could do. Now, some were and some weren't. So it was a bit of a learning curve because sometimes people will tell you they're good at something and then they're not. So they have an overinflated, sense of what they can accomplish. But again, that's why you need to have a process for moving people to either a different role or off the board or out of the organization. Right. So make sure your finance person is good at finances. Make sure your secretary is great at documentation and all the details. Make sure your event coordinator can actually plan it, right? Or your whatever that you have on your board. And make sure everybody knows exactly what their role is on the board. So they don't cross. Again, everybody's staying in their lane.
Yeah.
And then I think it's really important to be efficient. So, follow Robert's rules or whatever that book is. I can't remember. I read it several years ago, but follow the rules of holding a board meeting to a T. And you have bylaws, you have a handbook. There are things that you should have in place as a nonprofit you should have term limits. How do we bring on board members? How do we off board members? And follow them.
Mhm.
Because a big mistake nonprofits make is allowing people to stay past their term limits. And they're there for a reason. So sometimes you need to move people out, especially as an organization grows and evolves. You've got people who are there for seasons.
Yeah.
And as a leader of the board, you need to recognize what season you're in. So you've got a startup season, you've got a fundraising season, you've got whatever you define, and then you lead your board accordingly for
Yeah.
the season. And with the future in mind, how are you going to pay for things? Where are you going? How are you tracking your donation? All of that, or your fundraising or your donors.
Mhm.
So hopefully, yeah, and have that handbook, your code of ethics. You need to have that. If you're bored, if somebody's listening to this and you don't have that, you need to stop everything and get it. And you
Absolutely.
need to have everybody sign it. I'm sorry. I know that sounds
Would
so
you
transactional and administrative, but you will need it. I promise you.
would you say it's kind of would you say structure it like a contract kind of thing?
Yes. Well, when you have your bylaws, you have term limits, you have
Mhm.
who's doing what as you set up the board. In your handbook, it's
That's all in the
how
box.
to, yeah, it's how do we behave on social media? How do we behave at a function? What are our code of ethics? And you need to plan for the worst, be prepared for the worst, and hope it never happens.
Yeah.
A legal standpoint. And because if you don't, and then you have legal issues, if you haven't done your paperwork and you haven't followed some particular protocol to protect the interests of the nonprofit, you can get in trouble.
So, is there anything you want to leave with our listeners today? Piece of advice or encouragement or anything?
Well, we can only expect people to grow to the extent we're willing to grow ourselves. So if you're leading a board or you're the executive director or you're in charge of something, you have to lead by example and put yourself, hold yourself to a higher standard than you would hold anybody else. The other thing that is actually, it's a third book that I've written. It's sitting on my computer. I haven't done anything with it yet, but it's called Follow the Leader. And the most important thing you could learn is to be a good follower before you become a leader. So you need to learn what it means to be loyal at the back of the room, not when you're at the front of the room. Yeah. And as you move your way to the top of the room, learning everything at each step, because I think sometimes people think when I get to the front of the room, I'm going to have everything I need to be a leader. But you didn't learn how to communicate back here, or the steps to move into leadership. If you didn't learn to communicate on that journey, your leadership, it's going to be even harder because you haven't learned the necessary skills to do well. And your learning curve, it's not that you can't, but you're going to have a steep learning curve in that position or title or position of influence. So learn to follow. Be a good follower. Be loyal. Communicate, serve. Keep your mouth shut sometimes and just watch and learn. Take notes, because observe and learn and soak it in like a sponge. So the day that you move into that influential position, you can just pour out into people instead of being so needy and them having to still pour into you. That would be my close.
That is so good. Thank you so much for your time today. Greatly appreciate it. I know I got a lot out of it, and I hope our listeners do too.
Yeah, good. If they can email me, I don't know if you put it, Darla Harms 356@gmail.com.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll put that in the show notes, and then any other links you have to your content.
I'm on Facebook. I keep it pretty simple these days, so just find me on Facebook or send me an email if you got a question.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you too.